I want to talk about this amazing molecule called RNA. And as Brother Bill mentioned, I studied this particular kind of molecule in my dissertation work. So a lot of people know about DNA and proteins. You've heard of those things. RNA is sort of more of a fringe molecule, but the fact of the matter is, and I can't be objective, I have to admit, this is the most wonderful, amazing molecule God created. Of all the molecules that He created, now you can think of DNA and you can think of lipids. A lot of you probably don't like lipids so much. You know what those actually are, fat molecules, yeah. But I like to think of RNA as the wonder biomolecule. Biomolecule means it's a molecule required for living organisms to live. What is RNA? It's ribonucleic acid. Now, I could spend a lot of time talking about all of that, but I'm not going to. I am going to just move on and tell you a little bit about what it is and what it does. All right? RNA is in the news because of this new mRNA vaccine. How many of you have heard? Surely you've heard about the vaccine, but have you heard that it's an RNA vaccine? Okay, well, there are several different kinds of RNA. They're all made of the exact same stuff, ribonucleic acid, but they have different functions. And so they are called mRNA or rRNA or tRNA or SNP. There's a lot of different kinds of them. The vaccine is messenger RNA. And what I've got to do is try to sync these two things up here together. So excuse me if there's a little break here when I'm trying to do this. So what I want to talk about is what is mRNA, and I'm also going to be talking about some of the things that it does. And when you think and learn about what it does, as well as some of the other RNAs that God created to make a living cell be able to do what it does, my goal isn't so much to inform you about the wonders of the chemistry of RNA, but to hopefully cause you to just go, man, God is really, really intelligent, and His ability as an architect and a chemist to put all of this together so that it works the way it works should just make God just even that greater in our estimation about who He is and what He has done. So we'll talk about where it comes from, what it does, very, very briefly. Messenger ribonucleic acid is just one of the many fantastically complex molecules that all work together so that a living cell can do what it does, so that an organism can live. There are surely molecules, like I've already mentioned, that you'd probably heard of before, and maybe until the vaccine you never even had heard of RNA. But one of the amazing molecules that most people have heard of at this point in their lives is DNA. DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid, so its chemistry is virtually identical to RNA. It's only missing an oxygen. Deoxyribonucleic acid, that's what DNA is. But that one oxygen that's missing in DNA in every one of its little building block units makes DNA and RNA have incredibly different abilities and characteristics. And God used that to enable RNA to do things that DNA can't do. So here's a picture of an RNA. This happens to be the RNA that I worked on for, there was DNA. Sorry, I've got to keep up with this. This is the molecule of RNA that I worked on for 7 years. And all I was actually doing was working on the little, does this have a laser? Oh, good. Was this little part of it. I spent 7 years trying to characterize the importance of that little portion of that RNA and how it functions in the ribosome. That's a machine that makes your proteins. Another very complex and fancy biomolecule that God created were lipids. Those are responsible for making the cell membranes that keep all the parts of your cells in, keep good stuff in, keep bad things out. And this is part of the problem with the virus. It's able to get in because it's tricking the outside of the cellular membrane to think that it's something that the cell wants, when actually, of course, the cell doesn't want that virus inside, but It sort of tricks it by causing the membrane to open up and allowing the virus in. And then the real workhorses of the cells are proteins. And real quick, that is a glucose molecule. Can you see the difference in the shape of this giant molecule here and here? What's happened is this little glucose has moved around, it's gotten inside, and once it gets right there, this whole molecule clamps down. There's the glucose inside. This enzyme changes it. Tiny little chemical change opens back up, and then that glucose molecule goes on for another chemical reaction to take place, ultimately to make energy so that your cells can carry out the chemistry that they need to live. All of those fancy molecules and more are perfectly arranged into a cell. Now, this is a eukaryotic cell, it's called. It's got a nucleus. There are cells, simple cells, bacteria, that don't have a nucleus. But in a eukaryotic cell, this nucleus holds the DNA, which carries the information on what physically you are. All right? I like to think of this as a city. I like to think of some of these parts as factories. I like to think of some of the molecules as workers, some of the molecules as tools. And what I like to think of the DNA as is the blueprint, the original blueprint that has all the instructions to make the whole city, whether it's the roads or the buildings or the plumbing or the electricity, all of it. When an architect is paid a bunch of money to build a blueprint for, let's make it simpler, your house, you don't give that blueprint to the carpenters to take out onto the work site and drop in the mud and spill coffee and destroy it. I mean, that is the original. It's expensive. And so what would you do? Well, you make little copies of portions of the blueprint and send it out with the carpenters or the part that the plumbers need or the part that the electricians need. They all just get a working copy. And if it gets destroyed, no big deal. You can just make another copy. This is exactly how God has designed the cell. The blueprint stays inside the nucleus where it's protected. But little copies of it get sent out into the cells, ultimately to make proteins. And those copies of the DNA are RNA molecules. I'm going to skip through a little bit of this DNA lecture, other than to say that DNA, as I mentioned, has the information to make all the proteins of the cell. It's interesting, though, it is able to replicate itself. Amazing. It does so by a bunch of proteins that are able to read it, bring the building materials in, read it. And so this is a picture of DNA, one strand of it being split into two, and then you know what happens. This DNA goes into one cell, DNA goes into another cell, and then you've got two cells with the instructions to be whatever that particular kind of cell is. So DNA can be replicated. DNA carries all the instructions on how to make a living organism, but it's the one and single copy of blueprint that is necessary to tell the cell what to do. And so you want to protect it. You don't want it getting all chewed up. The thing is, this RNA that is responsible for like the worker that goes out into the cell is very unstable. And so what is called this copy of a little bit of DNA, usually it's going to be a copy of what we call a gene. And I think that a good way to understand what's going on with the entire genome of information in a piece of in a DNA would be like the hard drive in my computer. I've got, as you can imagine, thousands and thousands of files in here, different PowerPoint programs, different letters, and all this kind of stuff. This computer is the DNA, the original print with all the information in it. But I'm just showing you one file. I've pulled it up and I'm showing you this one file, this RNA presentation in PowerPoint. Those files are like the genes. So if you need to make hemoglobin or you need to make insulin or something like that, the little file, a gene, is in the DNA. And how does the cell make just the hemoglobin? It copies the gene in the form of a messenger RNA molecule, and that messenger RNA molecule then goes out of the nucleus into the cell, and a machine then reads the messenger RNA molecule and makes the hemoglobin, or whatever it is that you're trying to make. Now, it's a lot more complicated than that, but here's a little graph. Here's the, what did I do wrong? Here's the, represents the DNA. Then a great big enzyme opens up the DNA and makes this little red messenger RNA. So there's a picture of it. So it's just single-stranded, and that messenger RNA, and we'll continue to use the example of hemoglobin, goes out into the cell, and then the machinery makes the hemoglobin. The best way to think about what is going on is the information that's in the DNA, call that the nucleic language, the nucleic acid language. Remember, deoxyribonucleic acid, ribonucleic acid, those have a language, the nucleic acid language. But the ribosome, which is a machine in your cell, translates, I mean literally, translates the nucleic acid into the, let's call it the amino acid language. And the amino acid language is what forms a big long chain into a protein, and then that protein carries oxygen in your blood, or chops up carbohydrates in your stomach, or carries glucose in and out of cells like insulin. So the information in the DNA will have instructions on how to make a protein that ultimately does the work in your cell to keep you alive. But to get from a nucleic acid to an amino acid language, you've got messenger RNA being read by a ribosome, which is using another kind of RNA called transfer RNA. That's the bridge between the nucleic acid language and the amino acid language. Do you realize that evolutionists talk about that kind of thing chemically happening by chance? That DNA sort of formed, and RNA sort of formed, and proteins sort of formed, and they all started working together in such a way that you get a living cell. It actually, because we understand this as well as we now do, is becoming less and less accepted that chemical evolution occurred on Earth. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the next meeting. Here's another picture of this process going on. There's the ribosome, that's this machine. The messenger RNA goes through it. These little tRNAs make a bridge between the messenger RNA, the nucleic acid language, and these little green things represent amino acids. They form a bridge between the nucleic acid and the amino acid, and then the amino acids get linked up into a chain, and they form this three-dimensional shape, and they then form the protein for whatever you need. This is a little picture of biomolecules at work. It's an artist's rendition, but it's sort of accurate in the kind of complexity, and just when we look at it, what a mess it would be, for example, down in that nucleus. You've got RNAs, you've got DNAs, you've got proteins, and they're all in a big jumble, but they're working together to make the cell be able to live. And then the cells work together to make tissues be either muscle or nerve. And then those tissues work together to make your body be able to do what it does. It's truly, truly astounding. You know, people, we get upset when we get sick. You know, we get upset when it's not working right, right? Brothers and sisters, it is astounding that it works at all. But it does. And it all boils down to atoms being joined together in specific ways to form chemicals that work in specific ways to carry out all the biomolecular reactions that make life possible. It's truly astounding. But as wonderful as RNA is, it can also be a very, very nasty molecule. I'm going to show you a list of things here. You know what hepatitis, influenza, rabies, Zika, dengue, West Nile, yellow fever, foot and mouth, measles, and mumps all have in common? They're all viruses. They all make you pretty sick, and they are all RNA viruses. They don't carry around a piece of DNA that has the information to make the proteins that make the coat and all the different parts of the virus. It's a little piece of RNA that they carry around. And what's sort of interesting is I'm not going to say totally, but it seems like the diseases, the viruses that the human body has more trouble with, coming up with antibodies and eventually giving you immunity and curing it, are RNA viruses, not DNA viruses. And there's reasons for that, but I'm not going to go into that. But all of these have in common that they're RNA viruses. And, of course, the new bad guy on the block, the coronavirus. It is an RNA virus, the little piece of information that directs the cell on how to make its little parts and then keep multiplying and spreading in your body and causing the reactions that the disease produces. That information is carried in the RNA. It's one of those little copies of DNA. Where's the DNA from? Well, we don't know. I mean, these viruses are goofed up chunks of information. Maybe the corona was from a bat. It's likely. It probably also was engineered to a certain extent. But anyway, it's an RNA virus. We've all seen pictures of it. Why is it called a corona? Well, because it's got these weird little things that almost look like crowns sticking out of it. Those proteins, that's what they are, they're proteins on the surface. Those are what interact and fool the cell to think that it's something that the cell wants to bring inside. There's a protein, so there's a protein on the surface of the cell. This thing has these proteins on the outside. They bump into the receptors, they're called, and the cell is fooled, and it thinks that this is something it wants. And what does it do? It opens up and it lets that virus into the cell. And then the messenger RNA that encodes for making the parts of that virus inside the cell start getting read by the ribosomes. The parts all get put together, and your cell pumps out a whole bunch of new viral particles. Sort of insidious, isn't it? I don't have time to go through this chart, but all I want you to note from this chart is it's a graph of the whole life cycle of the virus. Here's the virus. It's hitting this receptor. It's getting inside. But down here is the nucleus. And everything, because this isn't a DNA virus, because it's an RNA virus, it sort of skips all that process of opening up the DNA, making a messenger RNA, taking it out of the nucleus into the cytoplasm, having a ribosome read it. It just jumps right to have the ribosome read this little information on the messenger RNA and start making proteins. So it skips all the normal process that your body goes through to make proteins, whether it's hemoglobin or insulin or whatever we're talking about. So that little piece of RNA has bits of information on it that tells your cellular apparatus, here's the translation, then it goes on to then make all these proteins, and boom, out it goes, all right? So this virus does not go through any stage where it becomes DNA, all right? It just tells the cell to make more of the viral parts. The thing is, it's been a terrible plague, right? We, I think especially as conservative believers and recognizing God's judgment on the earth for sin, and I'm not saying that this is absolutely specifically like the end is near or whatever, but we just see that this kind of thing is used by God to get people's attention and let people know we're out of control, and it's a product of sin. Would you agree? Most of us tend to see that, this is it's coming. But there's some information about the process that has been going on to develop the vaccine that I think most believers don't understand. And what I would submit to you is, within the midst of what we recognize as judgment, we can also see the grace of God in the development of this vaccine, because it is astounding. People are concerned because they did it so quickly. But they couldn't have just done it quickly because they ignored all kinds of safety devices and all that kind of. They did it quickly because everything fell into place at just the right time. And I want to read from a purely worldly, a very reputable. I mean, when the MIT Technology Review publishes something, I don't think they have an agenda. I think they're just telling us how things are. This particular article does a really excellent job of chronicling the development from 20 years back. The development of how we came to the point of being able to produce this virus. The MIT Technology Review is what I'm going to be sharing just a couple quick quotes from that was published in February of this year. Quote, adding to mRNA vaccines' chance of success was a lucky break. Okay. I say, whoa, okay, God's doing something here. Injected into the arm, the nanoparticles, this is what protects the RNA so that it doesn't get immediately chewed up by your body. Holding the critical instructions seem to home in on dendritic cells, the exact cell type whose job is to train the immune system to recognize a virus. So this was just a lucky break that when you get the vaccine, it goes right to where doctors would want it to go so that it would be most effective. What's more, something about the particles put the immune system on alert. It wasn't planned, but they were working as what's called vaccine adjuvants. We couldn't believe the effect. Weizmann was one of the main researchers. Sometimes when you get a vaccine, your body just ignores it. And so you put something with it to make your body go, hey, wait, there's something foreign in here, to get your immune system recognizing it and to start working. So this particle that they've discovered very, very recently, 5 years ago they couldn't have done this. This particle that they could encase the RNA in had more than just the benefit of protecting the mRNA. It caused it to go right to the right spot, and it causes your immune system to react to it quickly. Then the Moderna company that's making one of the vaccines, the CEO said this, Stefan Bancel, calls the way COVID-19 arrived just as messenger RNA technology was ready was an aberration in history. In other words, we got lucky. Now, do you think that's an aberration in history? That the development of the techniques that are being used and then the way what they use to get the virus to work in your system were lucky breaks? Or do you think that in the midst of God getting people's attention and judging the earth to the extent that he has with this plague, he also has this little sliver of grace, this little providential, yeah, but okay, here you go. I find it encouraging to see God at work, not just in judgment, but in these little clues that he's working, and he's waiting for people to acknowledge that they need him. Of course, what does man do? Oh, we're so lucky. Oh, we're so brilliant and everything. Well, that's the world's opinion. But I think the Lord is talking to a lot of people through this. So, I am not going to open this up for questions, but I would imagine probably many of you have some questions. And so during our break time, I'll be glad to try and answer some. And if there's any crucial ones, well, there's so many crucial ones, but we just don't have the time. So let's have a word of prayer. And I think you're dismissed. I went 5 minutes over. Sorry. Lord, we do recognize your hand in these things, and it's an example of the amazing complexity, sophistication, and beauty of your creation to make living things gone amok, just like sin in the garden just caused everything to go amok. It's a terrible corruption of the beauty of your creation. And so I want to thank you for the ability that you've given us to try and circumvent some of the effects of this awful disease. I want to thank you for the protection that I'm certain most of us have experienced in this room. Lord, for those that perhaps have lost loved ones, I don't know here in this audience, but I pray that you would comfort and help us just be good representatives of the Lord Jesus Christ as we deal with this. Help us be wise, help us not be fearful, but just trust you. We pray in Jesus' name.